Welcome. My name is Scott Boyles, and I'm going to be your trainer for this brief 30-minute webinar, the ASAM Criteria 3rd edition or 4th edition, a conundrum or not. We're going to lean toward it's probably an or not. Just briefly about me, I work for a company called the Change Companies, which is part of a larger organization called Train for Change, or vice versa. I work for Train for Change, which is actually part of a larger corporation called the Change Companies. I've been training off and on in the ASAM criteria since about 1993. Very excited about this 4th edition, which has been recently released, or it's been almost 2 months ago now, I think, maybe a month ago. And I definitely have a little bit of a bias. I think it's a phenomenal improvement to all of the decades of work that's previously been done to get it where it currently is. So there definitely an evolution of improvement of the criteria, and this is the most current edition with the 4th edition that we will be talking about for the next next 30 minutes or so here. We're not going to be handling any questions. I will give you my email at the end of the training, and you can follow up with questions. If for some reason you happen to be watching this as a recorded training, please don't hesitate to follow up with questions and just say, hey, I watched the 30-minute webinar, and it was, first of all, say how awesome it was, and then definitely offer your questions via email if they don't get asked here, because this thing's going to go super quick. Which might be good news for you. This is just a brief description of the training, and hopefully we'll be able to identify a couple of few differences between the 3rd edition and the 4th edition. The way this training is going to work, I'm going to put up a poll. I'll give you like 30 seconds-ish to read the poll question, formulate an answer in your own mind. There's no way to enter a response, so just write down your own response for the question. You might even take a screenshot so you can keep the poll question in front of you as I continue to talk about it. I think we have, I don't know, maybe 4 poll questions, which will be kind of the foundation for the discussion over the course of the training. So I'll show a slide that looks like this. It says poll. And as soon as I show that slide, there's going to be a poll question. Here's our first poll question. From my personal perspective, the intent and use of the risk ratings in the 3rd edition are, and I won't read the responses. I'll give you whatever, 30 seconds-ish, so you can choose your own response. My timer is out of whack here. And we're going to call that 30 seconds. I've been training on the ASAM criteria, like I said, for quite some time. And what I find is, I just found it literally last week, November 2023, last week, people are completely misusing and misunderstanding the risk ratings. So the risk ratings have been this ongoing kind of set of confusion in the context of the criteria, frequently not used accurately or as described. So the beauty of the 4th edition is instead of 3rd edition had risk ratings over here, you'd people would think you would go through the risk ratings and then you'd try and make the risk ratings fit to the level of care, or the risk rate. Some people thought the risk ratings were actually the dimensional admission criteria in the 3rd edition, which they're not. But lots of struggles between connecting those two in the 3rd edition. In the 4th edition, the risk ratings are combined and specifically assigned to a level of care, and specifically assigned to a dimension. So the risk rating is in essence a marker for a level of care, and they're connected. We're not trying to connect the dots like we've historically done with the 3rd edition. The risk ratings are not just 0 through 4 anymore. So it's just not this continuum, but the risk ratings include things like 0, no specific needs at this time. a need for additional evaluation, which might be relative more specifically in dimension 1. Where additional evaluation information is needed. There's a risk rating of MOUDC, medication for opioid use disorder continuation. So that would be dimension 1 risk rating, which would imply additional needs around their medication. Any risk rating of any, meaning there's an issue here that needs to be addressed, but it could be addressed across any level of care. So those are just a few variations in the risk ratings, which make them kind of more user-friendly, more flexible, and more applicable. But again, the big piece here is a risk rating is really an indicator of a specific level of service. They're directly connected, where historically they haven't been connected. Historically, they were never intended to be connected. And historically, people have tried to connect risk ratings inaccurately to specific levels of care. So this is a significant shift in how we're going to understand, use, and maintain better fidelity to the criteria with those level of care decisions. And that's also supported by a clear written algorithm for level of care decisions. So our dimensional admission criteria and our dimensional admission criteria rules are going to be much more clear when we're choosing level of care and easier to explain. Poll number 2, here it comes. Our agency offers long-term remission monitoring services for a chronic condition with an indefinite length of stay based on patients' preferences. True or false? I'm going to say you only get 10 seconds for a true false. It's 50-50, right? And we will call time on the question. So we've known it's a chronic condition for how long? For decades, we've known addiction is a chronic condition. For decades, we've designed acute models of care to treat the chronic condition. The 4th edition brings forth, with better descriptors, especially in the context of level 1 care, which has been redefined in a way to truly address a chronic condition. So level 1 care has multiple levels of care, defined as level 1, 1.5, and 1.7. For the sake of our brief discussion today, we're just going to talk about level 1. Level 1 has been retermed to long-term remission monitoring. So now we have some structures and some descriptors of what this level of care looks like, who this level of care is appropriate for, which will hopefully support more effective delivery of a chronic model of care. So long-term remission monitoring, folks who have a diagnosis of sustained remission would be the diagnostic admission criteria for this level of care. Within the context of this level of care, we have a recovery management plan compared to a relapse prevention plan. We have a remission or potentially a remission maintenance plan and offer recovery management checkups. So again, even the language of this level of care is more consistent with this chronic model of care and or remission management or remission monitoring. There's a recovery capital assessment, which is done at least quarterly. So in essence, that would be somewhat similar to what we've historically thought of as a treatment plan update or a continued stay review. But there is at least quarterly this recovery capital assessment. And that might include some measurement-based care tools, something like an assessment of recovery capital, a brief assessment of recovery capital, the BARC 10 would be the acronym for that tool. So we got some new cool acronyms for measurement-based care tools. Recovery capital tool, which is called a RECCAP. These aren't things you have to use, but these might be things that could be helpful when looking at these quarterly reviews. This also is an introduction to the measurement-based care piece, which is also new within the context of the 4th edition, which gives us more objective measures to think about progress, and also allows the person served to be a part of that discussion based on those measures and their perspective of their progress. So again, measurement-based care is relative here and across actually use of the 4th edition in a number of different dimensions. Moving right along. This has nothing to do with the 4th edition. I just thought it was funny. After listening to his owner drone on for hours, Ralph suddenly realized he was not cut out to be an emotional support dog after all. All righty, moving on to poll number 3. Ready? Here it comes. I believe it's unreasonable to complete a biopsychosocial assessment and a treatment plan during the initial session, which we know is frequently like an hour, 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. You got 30 seconds for your best answer. I'm going to call time. Here it comes. Best answer, believe it or not, all of the above, all of the above. We have a really interesting system where we have turned this assessment into an event instead of a process. We know assessment is a process, but we've pretended as if it's an event. I'm going to do a full biopsychosocial assessment with you, ask you multiple questions, come up with a diagnosis, come up with a level of care decision, and develop a plan of care all in the first session, which is really, I think, noted some of the challenges and or problems with this within the context of these poll questions. So the beauty of the 4th edition is they've separated this process. So there's, in essence, 2 assessments. So there's the level of care assessment or the initial assessment. And what's that going to focus on? It's going to focus on what are the specific things we need to know to make a level of care decision. And so within the context of each dimension, each of the 5 dimensions, there are subdimensions. And what they've done in the 4th dimension or 4th edition is identify in each dimension, there's certain subdimensions that we would address as part of the level of care assessment. So we're gathering information pertinent to those subdimensions to make a level of care decision. After the person has entered services, then we're going to do a second assessment, which is really an evolving process here from the initial assessment, but that second assessment is titled the treatment planning assessment. So then we're going to be more comprehensive in gathering clinical information across all 5 dimensions. The other kind of nice thing in the 4th edition is they've identified kind of what are the goals for each dimension, not the treatment goals, but what are the goals of the assessment for each dimension, which also gives us some more language and reference, which is helpful to understand the dimensions, but 2 components there. And then this term dimensional drivers, wherever the most concern is, whatever the dimensions are that are going to make that level of care decision or support the level of care decision based on the severity, those would be noted as the dimensional drivers, which is terminology that some states have used off and on for many, many years, kind of the driving dimension. So ASAM has embraced that, and the driving dimensions are the dimensional drivers, which drive the level of care decision. are then going to drive the treatment planning process. And of course, as I mentioned, we're going to be updating clinical information, continuing to gather clinical information after the person has been admitted, to develop those individualized treatment plans, which are going to revolve around those drivers. We might also find that new drivers come up over the course of that evaluation. We almost would possibly expect new drivers to come up, because rarely do we figure everything out in the first session, which is another thing historically we've acted as if we kind of figure everything out and then do a plan of care and we're good to go. The fourth edition really is designed to evolve the assessment over the entire course of care and update and revise the treatment plans based on the dimensional drivers, progress on addressing those dimensional drivers, and or potentially lack of progress. So the level of care assessment, here, I won't read the entire slide to you, but just kind of reiterating that it's hopefully to expedite the process of gathering enough information to make a level of care decision, make that brief, less painful, less intrusive for the person served. Just think about some of the questions we ask, which may not be the most helpful questions. They might be important questions and good pieces to know about information, but some of the questions we ask right off the bat may not be helpful, or a way to engage with people who may not trust us and may not be ready to enter services, or may not have great engagement skills themselves. So it's also hopefully decreasing some of the burden for the provider, but more importantly, the burden that we inadvertently place on the people we serve with a barrage of dozens and dozens of incredibly intrusive questions that may not be helpful at that point in time for either the person served or the provider. So 2 parts: level of care assessment, admit the person into care, we establish trust, build relationship, continue to gather information in all 5 dimensions, and evolve the treatment plan and possibly add on to the treatment plan. So another way to conceptualize this, there's an initial treatment plan based on the level of care assessment, then we will evolve that based on new assessment information. You may also note, I keep saying the 5 dimensions, noting that there are 5 dimensions that we're doing the assessment on. And then there is the 6th dimension, which is called person-centered considerations. And the 6th dimension is what we're using as this wonderful framework to say, okay, we've made a level of care decision, we've offered that recommendation. And the 6th dimension is really this nice structure to help us talk about the recommendation, the barriers to care, person's perspective about their desires for care, their reasons they may want care or they may not want care. So motivational components that we may need to address with the person served. Brings in the idea of social determinants of health, where the person lives, works, plays. Kind of this much broader consideration of what we've historically thought about dimension 6, what kind of barriers and supports may impact their participation in care, what kind of barriers and supports might we think about that may impact their ability to continue to participate in care once they've started in care. So dimension 6 offers us a lot of things, everything from looking at motivation and desires, but also to look at barriers to care, but also looking at how do we keep people engaged in care after they've started care. So that's another piece that's incorporated within the context of person-centered considerations in dimension 6. And I don't have a slide on that. I wasn't going to get fully into that in our brief little 30-minute gig here, but some pieces just to help understand 5 assessment dimensions for clinical needs. Dimension 6, person-centered considerations. Let's have a discussion about what's going to work for you based on many things. And culture would also be a significant piece of that dimension 6 discussion, as would trauma. So additional pieces around culture, not just additional, but significantly additional pieces around culture, trauma, social determinants of health, and harm reduction within the context of the fourth addiction. And a number of these pieces fall within that person-centered consideration in dimension 6. So really giving us some great structures and frameworks for truly understanding individualized needs, I think, in a more profound way than what we've historically had. Good stuff. This is that treatment plan piece when we talked about treatment plans or the treatment plan assessment separate after the person is admitted to the level of care. Just to give you just a super quick glimpse, these are some of the timelines that allow us to do that additional treatment planning assessment that I mentioned previously. And you can see the different timelines based on different levels of care, kind of general concepts that we've historically seen in the field. The more intensive the levels of care, the sooner the treatment plan needs to be developed based on the acuity of what's going on with the person served. High acuity, more immediate treatment plan. Levels of care that aren't as intensive, there's broader windows to develop that treatment plan, which is also relevant to how frequently we're seeing the person to gather the information we need for that treatment planning assessment. So just some general timelines. I mentioned dimensional drivers, and again, here's just the slide on the dimensional drivers. But I would also note that those dimensional drivers, again, really help us understand what's the continued stay need and or what's the transition criteria. And transition criteria in lieu of discharge criteria, they've eliminated discharge criteria from the text. Another piece to conceptualize this is a chronic condition. You just don't discharge and you're done. So we're thinking about transition, but very clear transition and discharge criteria for each level of care, and transition and continued stay criteria specific to dimensions. So that's much more specifically than it's historically been in the third edition, transition and or discharge criteria. The other thing that's happened is historically providers, we didn't see a lot of providers using the continued stay and transfer criteria in the third edition. Like it was, I don't know, it was less common than common. And what we have seen for years is providers trying to use the admission criteria to justify continued stay in the third edition. It's not designed to do that, but that's had become kind of a default, if you will. Use the admission criteria to justify continued stay instead of using the continued stay criteria in the third edition. In the fourth edition, again, based on the revisions, we are really using the admission criteria to help support our continued stay rationale. In essence, it's saying if the dimensional drivers that supported the admission to the level of care are still present and severe enough for that level of care, then we would keep them in that level of care. That would be a component that we would be looking at to explain our continued stay rationale for a level of care as they continue to meet admission criteria for that level of care. And it goes into more depth and detail than that, specifically to each level of care and the dimensions within a level of care. But it's really, again, tying some logic and some structure to, if they still meet the admission criteria for that level of care, they would still be appropriate for that level of care. And that would be one of our continued stay considerations. Looking at time, holy cow, where does the time go when you're having so much fun? Okay, I'm assuming the time is going quick, but I know you're having fun. So poll number 4, here it comes. Disagreeing with the level of care recommendation is indicative of a person who's in pre-contemplation. This is a quick one. True, false, your best guess. Time. False. We're going with false as the bestest answer. So dimension 4 historically has been readiness to change. readiness to change has been removed in the dimension 4 readiness to change has been removed from the 4th edition. Frequently a misunderstood dimension historically. Readiness to change was implied in the context of dimension 4 that we're looking at dimension 4 as part of our level of care decision when we were using the 3rd edition. But the reality is readiness to change was not super relative and was not a key driver, if you will, for the level of care decision. And I don't know how long ago, whatever, 9 years ago, really started focusing on it in training. Dimension 4 is a way to understand and conceptualize the stage of change based on a specific issue, not based on the person, but what's their stage of change around a specific issue, substance use disorder, mental health condition, type of substance. And it's a way to really understand and formulate what might be the most appropriate interventions and approaches based on that person's stage of change, which may not necessarily be relevant to the level of care, but much more relevant to how we're formulating the plan of care. So readiness to change, dimension 4, is no longer in the 4th edition. They've noted it to be something that's going to go across all 6 dimensions. So we can use the model readiness to change to think about where folks are at in dealing with their medical condition or possibly medication needs around an opiate use disorder, looking at mental health conditions, looking at changes in support systems, and obviously looking at their substance use and looking at potentially multiple substances. So readiness to change is not completely removed, but in the context of looking at all 5 dimensions and also potentially relative to person-centered considerations in dimension 6. And on that note, dimension 6, I already touched on this. If you just want some content and slides, the dimension 6 subdimensions, there's three components here. And again, reminding dimension 6 is the final piece of the level of care assessment, and really talking about what are the needs of the person, what are their beliefs. This comes with this idea of shared decision making. We aren't waiting to develop the treatment plan to become collaborative. That's the other thing that's always interested in care is once we got people into care and they were willing to agree to do what we told them to do, then we got patient-centered. But there was always conditions before we became patient-centered. Or it's like, we're going to be collaborative, we're going to have a partnership, but we're going to wait and do that when we start to develop the treatment plan. We're not going to do that initially. And I don't know if it's always played like that. I don't think we've truly waited, but sometimes it seemed like that. And dimension 6 is really saying right off the bat, we now have the structure and framework to have this shared decision-making discussion, to build on engagement and collaborate with the person served, to hear their voice. I can't tell you, I've heard dozens and dozens of times, what do we do with the person served if they don't agree with the treatment recommendations? There's never been a clear structure and guidelines on how to have discussions about that. That's what dimension 6 is now providing, a much more comprehensive structure and set of guidelines or standards to really help us have those discussions. And that's, again, where social determinants of health, culture, possibly trauma would all be relative to those person-centered considerations in dimension 6. And all those issues could be relative to other dimensions too, but definitely social determinants of health is a key piece, as is culture when we're thinking about these person-centered considerations in dimension 6. And in case you didn't happen to know what social determinants of health were off the top of your head, here's just a brief definition on the slide. We've got about 3 more minutes, so I'm going to start jamming here just a little bit. And these are the goals, as I said earlier in the presentation. Each dimension has goals, and these aren't, again, goals for the person served, but these are goals for what we're trying to accomplish as part of the assessment in the dimension. And here are just example of some of the goals when we're thinking about Dimension 6 needs. Other key piece, harm reduction. Again, is part of this Dimension 6 component, but there's significantly more language, discussion, and information around harm reduction services in the 4th edition compared to historically noted in the 3rd edition. We're down to our last poll and we're practically on time. I'm sorry, we have 2 more polls and we're practically on time. So we'll wrap this thing up in 2 minutes if you can hang tight. Poll number 5. If we must continue the use of the 3rd edition, we can make significant small incremental improvements by tapping into the content of the 4th edition. Oh, you don't even need 10 seconds for this one. By gosh, there's only one answer. It's not that I'm controlling. It's just the fact is there's only one answer. And when you get to make the test, you can make it however you want. Excuse me. We're calling that bad boy true. If you're using the 3rd edition, there's so many things in the 4th edition that can help you improve the use of your 3rd edition, because at some point you're going to be using the 4th edition. Just like I said, trauma, culture, social determinants of health, harm reduction are all key things that we can use the information and expertise delineated in the 4th edition to improve our services across the board, regardless of what edition we are using. Conceptualizing level of care decisions and then taking more time for a more comprehensive treatment planning assessment is a piece that we could take from the 4th edition and help improve our use of the 3rd edition. Medication needs across all levels of care. Medication for addiction medicines across all levels of care. Chronic disease management. Remission monitoring. Things to consider that are relative to people with substance-related disorders. The people we serve aren't waiting for what edition we're using. The people we serve shouldn't have to wait for the next edition or the state or the county or the provider to implement that edition. So let's steal good stuff out of the 4th edition. We can cherry pick it, if you will, and start using it to improve effective use of what we're currently doing in our day-to-day work with the 3rd edition, or if we aren't using any edition. There's great pieces here to improve the quality of care and the services we provide. On that note, we're going to wrap it up. A few takeaways. Risk ratings are directly connected to level of care. No more magic math or anything like that. There's a clear connection between risk rating and level of care. Long-term remission monitoring services. Level 1, we have a chronic condition. The people we serve deserve, the people we serve deserve a chronic care model, not an acute care model for their chronic condition. Level 1 is significant here. Talked about level of care, assessment, treatment planning assessment. Considered considerations in Dimension 6, that collaborative engagement and a place to do it and structure to have some of those discussions. Last but not least, we talked about harm reduction, trauma, cultural humility, cultural needs, but cultural humility from a provider perspective, and understanding social determinants of health and how those broadly and systemically impact the people we serve and the services we deliver and their access to those services, and also their success in those services. And ironically, their long-term success and health overall. So really thinking from a broader systemic level with social determinants of health and how that impacts the people we are working with. And then if nothing else, like MBC, measurement-based care. There's so many new acronyms. So that's always exciting too. On that note, thanks for coming. Sorry, I think I went over 4 minutes. I apologize. There's just so much stuff. And it's actually, I don't know, from my perspective, it's super exciting stuff. I'm totally biased and on board with the 4th edition. I drank the Kool-Aid back in 1991. I'll thank Dr. David Lee and Jerry Schulman for that. exciting stuff to come here. This is, I think, really going to improve the quality of the work we do and the ease of use of the ASAM criteria. Okay, I'll get off the darn soapbox. Here's my email. Here's my phone number. I hope that's not a mistake. Shoot me a text. Tell me who you are so you don't creep me out, and shoot me a text. You can shoot me a text with questions, although I prefer questions on email because it's easier for me to answer emails. On that, have a nice day, nice afternoon, whatever you might be doing. I'm going to just wrap things up. We got music here somewhere, don't we? Oh, yeah, we got music.